All right, good afternoon, everyone. How are you doing?
We're at the end of the day, so we got to keep the energy really, really high.
You
guys okay? All right.
That's better. That's better. Well, I'm so excited to be here and to chat with you, Harley. Even though I came from Toronto, I actually went to high school here in Ottawa, so it's nice to be back. And hopefully you don't remember me from those years, because it was a little rough in those years, Harley.
I didn't know you in those years, so maybe that's a good thing.
It's probably a good thing. So we're going to take audience questions at the end of our chat. So we'll have about 10 minutes for audience questions. We're going to be throwing around a little cube, so you can take that and ask any question you may have. But just to start with, Harley, I was just thinking about something that happened to me recently. I was reading about the news of Uber setting up shop in Toronto with their artificial intelligence research hub, focusing on autonomous vehicles, and the media just went crazy. They were so excited about having this big American company coming to Canada, setting up shop. As I read further along in the story, there were only dozens of jobs, which really isn't that many jobs, and yet they got so much attention. So I wanted to ask you, how do we get this type of attention for homegrown companies?
It's like the most Canadian story ever, right? Uber opens 12 jobs in Toronto and it makes front page headlines. I think this has been a problem for a long time. I think that it's a couple things are at play here. First of all, I think as Canadians in general, Canadian entrepreneurs, we're not great at self-promotion. I try to be better at it, and maybe that's because I spent some time growing up in the US, but I don't think we're great at self-promotion. I think we have politicians and media in Canada who are somewhat obsessed with American companies, and I think that is disappointing. That's not great. It is changing though, and I'm already seeing that. In fact, we've been meeting with ministers for the last couple of months at Shopify through our team has been bringing them in, and we're trying to explain to them why we think that Canadian companies punch way above our weight class and why we think that they should start focusing and telling the stories of Canadian companies. But for a long time, we really didn't give the media in Canada very much fodder to write about, right? There was the stories like Nortel or BlackBerry that didn't end very well, and there weren't that many other stories that were able to make it past a certain point. From this stage, I think, a couple years ago, at one of the first Accelerate Ottawas, I said I think one of the biggest problems was that a lot of us sell out too early. We get these big offers or these big acquisition offers from American companies, and we kind of jump at them because it's exciting and we feel like, we think that's a really great opportunity. I think that's changing now. I feel like as Canadian entrepreneurs and the Canadian tech scene in particular, we're now realizing that we can build world-class companies from here, and we can potentially acquire American companies, which is what Shopify's been doing now for a little bit of time. So I do think that's changing, but clearly not fast enough because that Uber incident happened just a couple days ago.
Just a few days ago. But I will say, just to pick up on your point in terms of how things are changing for all of us here in Canada, it is interesting when we see the momentum that's happening right now. Whether you are talking about AI or VR, you're seeing these little hubs pop up. And I would love it if you could talk for a second about that momentum, because it feels like it's happened almost overnight. And I contrast that with the late 1990s when I moved out to San Francisco and there was this real brain drain from Canada. So can you talk about what you're seeing and why you're hopeful?
So I think this idea of these clusters is kind of, it's very popular right now. There's an AI cluster in Montreal and Toronto, and there's machine learning clusters elsewhere, and there's, I don't know, maybe e-commerce cluster here in Ottawa, which would be pretty cool. I'm not sure that's really happening. But I do think that what's happening is that a lot of companies are realizing that the Canadian geography, the Canadian talent pool is as good as any country, if not better. And I also believe that because of the loyalty that we have here, that so many people actually now want to stay in Canada and build, multi-billion-dollar companies here, that is really changing. So I think these clusters or these cities that have a bit of a theme to them, whether it's, again, AI or it's self-driving autonomous vehicles, we should use that. And we should ride the wave, and we should, we should ride the wave of getting some PR around that stuff because I think it's really helpful. But I'm not sure we should rest on our laurels. And by the way, I don't believe that, with the AI cluster happening in Toronto, some of the media had commented on the fact that they were disappointed that Google was such a big sponsor of that cluster. By the way, Shopify also put in 7 figures into that cluster. I don't think we should be upset about that. I think it's really great. It's an endorsement. I don't believe that the brain drain that we once saw happening particularly between Canada and Silicon Valley, is continuing. In fact, maybe just the opposite. We're now seeing people coming back to Canada who never thought they would. I think that's great.
So I think you're right, and we're seeing more people who are potentially going to stay here and who are going to start businesses, like many people who are in the room today. But I would still argue that in terms of the mentality that Canadians have, just to pick on what you said before, I think we have a hard time thinking bigger. I'm working on a project with Shopify with you guys right now to build a bigger business competition, and it just reminds me, when you talk to Canadians, they have a hard time thinking bigger. Can you stay here and build a multi-million or a billion-dollar company?
So, I mean, the question is absolutely yes, and I see people in the crowd like Craig from Page Cloud, who's certainly going to be doing that. We've certainly have done that at Shopify. You absolutely can do that. There is something about being in the Valley or being in a place like New York where you have a lot of people all simultaneously thinking very ambitiously. Toby and I used to take these trips down to San Francisco, and we would call them our recharge, our battery trips, where we would go really just for a couple days to recharge our ambition. And we'd come back here, and there would just be a sense of, all right, we can do this. We can build something really meaningful. I think part of what was lacking here for a long time may have been role models and mentors, and I think you have a lot more of them now. So I'm actually not really concerned about that lack of ambition. I believe that's changed. I'm not ever sure there was a lack of ambition. Perhaps what we saw here was that people didn't talk about their ambition because they felt that it was, it wasn't modest, and it wasn't really good. They weren't being good Canadians by talking about the fact they want to build these big independent companies here. But I do think that's changing. That being said, I mean, one of the reasons that I joined the board of C100 a couple years ago was I felt that it's really important to encourage Canadians and certainly people from Ottawa to get out of Ottawa and go meet other people and exchange best practices and war stories and listen to the different things that they're working on, how they're able to hire great talent. So I think it's getting easier, and the best thing I can tell you about that is, in the last 2 years at Shopify, we've hired guys like JML, who is CTO of Atlassian, and moved him from Australia to Ottawa. David Lenny, who comes from Netflix, moved him and his family to Ottawa as well. And now that they're here, they're also meeting other companies and telling them, hey, here's how you can acquire great talent from all over the world and bring them here. So I think we have more role models, and we're pretty excited to play some of that role. But there's a lot of these new role models popping up, which I think is increasing that battery of big ambition.
And maybe one thing that we can learn from some of the American companies out there, I would argue that they're better as far as communications and media and marketing as well in terms of talking about what they do. And I'll give you an example. I've interviewed a number of startups over the years, and I can't tell you how many times in Canada I'll sit down with the founder of a startup and ask them to explain to me what exactly they do. And they have a hard time doing that. And I'm sure there are people in the room right now who are building businesses who are struggling with being able to get out there and articulate what they're doing and to be able to explain it to people. How important is that?
Storytelling, I think, is something that is really important. And I think that, one of the great parts about the early days of Shopify was when I joined, there was, Toby and Cody and Daniel, these brilliant engineers, brilliant designers. And in many ways, I felt my job was to take what these brilliant people have built and just commercialize it as much as I can and tell that story ad nauseum. And I think that when I look at a lot of the companies that I know well or I've been involved with, it seems like you have that coupling of someone who's built something incredible, maybe it's the engineer, but there's either that person can do both, often not, and there's another person there whose job it is to go and tell that story around the world. And I think storytelling is really important. I don't know why that's so challenging. I think I do agree. I feel like other places, and I think Ottawa's getting better at telling our story, but I don't know why that's so challenging, but I think that's incredibly important as well.
Can you talk a little bit more as far as when you are starting a company and from the early days of Shopify, when is the right time to scale that business? When is the right time to walk away from that business? Because I think that's a moment where a lot of people really struggle.
I mean, I don't think there is a moment to walk away. If you believe in what you're doing, you're having fun. I mean, I'm the luckiest dude in the whole world, right? I get to do this incredible thing every day with people that I truly love working with and truly respect. I would love to work at Shopify the rest of my life. That brings up a concept that I've spoken a bit about in the past, which is this concept of life's work. And I think that the connotation of life's work has changed dramatically over the years. My father and even my grandfather and my grandmother, they worked jobs most of their lives that they hated so they can eventually retire to go do their life's work, whether that was philanthropy or that was travel or that was community work. So this idea of life's work kind of happened after your life. And I think for many of us, and I think one of the best parts of entrepreneurship is that for many of us, we're kind of doing our life's work right now during our lives. That's pretty amazing. For that reason alone, I mean, if you're unhappy and you're not challenged and you don't find the work you're doing meaningful, you should probably get out and not do that. But I certainly don't feel that way. The other side of the question in terms of when do you scale, I think scale is something that you should be thinking about from a very early stage. We made a decision early on, right before taking our Series A round of finance, which was 2010, where we had this decision, either Shopify was going to be a high growth company or it was going to be a lifestyle business. And if it's going to be a lifestyle business, we were going to make very different decisions. But if it's going to be a high growth company, then scale had to be a part of that. And not all companies need to raise venture capital. Not all companies have to IPO. Not all companies have to scale in that way. But certainly that was our ambition. And it's great to know that so many people in this room, some of which I'm a very proud investor in, have done that, which is so cool.
So I've known you for many years, and I know we weren't planning to talk about the hustle that you need to have to succeed in business, but I would like to get a little more practical as far as how you do achieve something like you've built with Shopify, and how do you have that extra push to go out there and be able to build something? From what I've seen with some of the most successful entrepreneurs is they have that spark inside them, and I know that sounds like a very something that's not so tangible, but you've seen it as well. And how do you get that if you don't have it?
So if you read business books, and I'm sure many people in this crowd read business books, some business books are horrible and you can kind of, it's 300 pages and really it's one page that makes all the difference. If you read business books going back 20, 30 years ago versus business books today, there is something fundamentally different thematically. The big difference is that 10, 20, 30 years ago, if you were the CEO of a company that sold tires, you actually didn't necessarily know very much about tires. In many cases, it was a widget to you. It was this commodity that you were selling. And whether you were selling tires, or you were selling speakers, or you were selling running shoes, you were kind of just selling a product. And I think today, when you read business books, or you read people that are then successful entrepreneurs, and you hear them talk about their business, something is different. They have a true understanding of what they're selling. They are obsessed with tires and sneakers and speakers. And I think in many ways, business today has become a lot more personal. And it certainly was for me. The reason it was personal for me was Shopify is not only my employer, it was also, it was the way that I put myself through school. It was the way that I put food on my table and put a roof over my head. I was one of the first customers of Shopify's, and it was life-changing for me. So how could I not have that amount of passion or that amount of perseverance or that amount of intensity about what we were doing when I'm now able to share what helped me and changed my life with 400,000 other merchants. But I think that is really different than it was going back, a couple decades ago when, my grandfather sold eggs. Some of you may have heard the story. He really didn't give a shit about eggs. What he cared about was survival. He cared about food on the table and a roof over his head. And I'm really lucky that I don't have to think about that anymore, and I can actually do something that I think is really meaningful in my life. So I'm not sure that answers the question, but it's something I've been thinking a lot about lately, is that this idea that business has become a lot more personal. It's also, there is a flip side to this business being personal thing, which is that we really don't have 9 to 5s, right? None of us shut off at 5 o'clock and shut off our iPhones or don't check email after that. So for many of us, this idea of work-life balance has actually turned into this idea of work-life harmony. And frankly, I'm okay with that. I like that my Saturday morning and my Monday morning kind of feels the same. When I practiced law, one of the things I hated was Sunday nights because Monday morning was happening. And that was because I separated my life from my work life. And I know you and see Brad Forsyth in the front, like the people that I know in this crowd, you guys don't separate your lives like that. It's all just life, and you fill your life up with these amazing things. And so I think if you truly care about what you're selling and what you're doing on a daily basis, it's kind of easy to have that hustle or whatever the term that you want to use is all about.
So just one more question before we're going to take questions from the audience. And I would like to have a quick conversation about risk, because I would say there's a lot of people probably sitting here today and a lot of people across the country who are entrepreneurs who are worried about starting their own business because they're worried about all of the risks that they're going to have to take. But if you think about it in terms of living in Canada, it's really not that risky necessarily to start a business, because you can always fall back on a great healthcare system, and there are many other positive things in this world. Can you talk about how important it is to focus on risk or not let that get in your way?
I mean, you're right. It's a lot less risky today to start a business. I believe that the cost of failure in 2017 to starting a business is trending towards zero. It's not zero because you have opportunity cost, which is what you're foregoing by starting that business, but it's getting pretty damn close to that, which creates a whole bunch of other issues like competition, right? If everyone can start a business, then everyone does start a business, and now you have everyone selling laceless chucks online. So it does create some more competition. I think that risk is something that is really personal, and I don't believe there's a certain time in your life. I mean, before you have a mortgage, maybe it's easier to take certain risks. Personal debt, for example, might be easier. But I think that the whole risk profile of entrepreneurship has changed dramatically. And one of the great parts about Shopify, and one of the things you're seeing with the Build a Bigger Business competition, is that so many of the people that are successful on our platform, in some cases that are selling hundreds of millions of dollars a year, they started with a side hustle. They actually didn't have a massive risk appetite. They were working at some big company, they were working at an IBM type of business, and on nights and weekends, they were fiddling at their kitchen table or in their garage with something. And they decided to open a Shopify store and start selling that thing. And then it was, okay, maybe I'll take Friday afternoons off and I'll start fiddling more. And I like this idea, whether you call it side hustle or side project or passion project. I like the fact that I'm seeing a lot of entrepreneurs now that I know have become really successful, that the way they started was relevant and appropriate to their risk appetite. And they didn't just jump in and say, I'm going to give up everything, I'm going to quit my job and sell my house and do it. I think the fact that you can do that today is a wonderful soft landing into entrepreneurship, as opposed to this crash landing where if it doesn't work, your kids aren't be able to eat that night, which, as someone who's a new dad, is really, really scary to me.
Absolutely, and just to pick up on that a little bit, one of the things I noticed from interviewing some of the mentors in the competition is one of the things they talk about all the time is the freedom that they have. These are the busiest people you could ever imagine, the busiest people I've met in the business world, but they feel as though they have the ultimate freedom to do whatever they want because they're in charge of their own destiny, and I think that's what entrepreneurship truly is all about.
Yeah, I mean, I think entrepreneurship is the best profession in the entire world, and for those of us that are able to do that, whether inside companies or on our own as sort of sole proprietorships, we are really, really lucky we get to do that. So yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, so we want to take some questions from the audience. We have about 8 minutes, so we can squeeze in a few questions. It would be great if you do get the cube, if you could ask just one question, not a two-parter, because we want to make sure we get as many questions in as possible.
And by the way, you don't only have to ask me questions. Like, Amber is like incredibly experienced and talented and accomplished, and so feel free to throw questions at her way also. She also gets to hang out with guys like Tony Robbins and guys like that. So
it's all good stuff. Is the cube around somewhere? Yeah, okay, there it is. So do we just throw it? Is that our plan? Do they raise their hand? Because I feel like we should just throw it at people, but that's just me.
That's a great idea.
That's my risky side.
Hey guys, I'm Jamie. I'm from Redoc. You talked a little bit about books, which I'm a huge bookworm. So what would be the #1 book that you would recommend to this crowd that we should actually pick up today and read?
So does it have to be a business book? Okay. So the best business book that I've ever read is High Output Management by Andy Grove from Intel. I think it's an old book. It's sort of an oldie but a goodie. I think High Output Management is something that most of the people that work with me is sort of required reading. I kind of go in a bit of themes with these business books. Again, some of them I find are really great. A lot of them are kind of a waste of time. But I would say High Output Management, if you haven't read it, is pretty fantastic. Another one that I loved was Anti-Fragile, which is Nassim Taleb's book. Anti-fragile, the whole premise is basically when you drop something. So most people assume the opposite of fragile is robust. So if you drop something and it breaks, it's fragile. And if you drop something and it doesn't break, that's the opposite, it's robust. But Talib, who also wrote Black Swan, often talks about the fact that some things, when they break, they actually get rebuilt stronger. Like a bone, if you break your arm and you fuse your bone together, your arm actually could be stronger than before you even broke it. And I think that's a really great metaphor for chaos that you're going to experience in any business. That one is something that I really love.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'll just add to that and say Amanda Lang has a new book out called The Beauty of Discomfort, which is a really great book about how everybody should get out of their comfort zone, whether it's in business or in your personal life, and it's a brand new book, so that's also a good one to add to the list.
You talked about the difference between Canadian and American firms and how maybe as Canadian firms we don't pound our chest enough. I happen to live in the States for 20 years and noticed a very significant difference in marketing that I always make a little joke about and say that the Americans, from a marketing perspective, can take an idea the size of a thimble and blow it up to be as big as this building. But as Canadians, we want to be so precise about everything that we'll take a thing the size of this building and shrink it down to the size of a thimble. And do you have any thoughts on how we can, like the American guys are not lying, but they're stretching the truth all over the place.
Right.
Do you have any thoughts on that and how we might be able to
Remedy that problem?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure I know how to get the Americans to start, being a little more realistic about what they're building. But actually, kudos to them for being that gung ho. The second day that I arrived at Shopify, we had an office above Tucker's Marketplace. Some of you may remember this. It was right above Tucker's. I think System Scope is there now, if I'm not mistaken. And at the time, I walked in there and remember seeing, looked up at the building, and it's in the middle of the Byward Market, which is a really busy place in Ottawa. And I called some random, signage company, and I put up a massive Shopify sign. And I got a ton of phone calls. I think even Toby came to see me. He's like, "You sure you want to put up such a big sign there?" And I was like, "Fuck yeah, I do. I want everyone to know that Shopify is here, and we're going to do something amazing here." And so there were probably a dozen people that would have encouraged me to take down that sign. Now, the sign is just a metaphor, right? But I think we need more people putting up their proverbial signs and being proud that we are based here and we're loud about it. So I think more role models are going to be really helpful. I mean, we've swapped out Canadian company signage for the American company signage who acquired them. That kind of sucks. I wish there were more Canadian company signage around. But I think more role models will be really helpful to that. And I'll make this offer. If any of you feel like you're not necessarily putting up your own proverbial sign, metaphorical sign, and you feel like you're scared or you're apprehensive to do so because you feel it's not modest or it's not Canadian, give me a shout. I'll knock some sense into you.
That's a good offer. You should take him up on that.
Yeah.
And that's another Canadian thing. Take Harley up on that offer.
I agree. Yeah, please do that. Don't be too polite about that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
My name is Ashley Cornier, and I am a social entrepreneur looking to start a social enterprise from the ground level. So what resonated with me the most was articulating what it is that you are doing. Could you maybe just elaborate on some ideas on what I could do in the scheme of social enterprise and how I could communicate what it is that I am doing?
One of the best ways to figure out exactly what you're selling is to ask the people who are buying it why they bought it. This is, I think it's Clayton Christensen who wrote The Innovator's Dilemma. He talks about the job that needs to get done. And so if you think about Shopify, right, an easy example, if you were to ask 10 people randomly on the street what Shopify does, you actually may get 10 different answers. They're all going to be kind of similar around e-commerce or online retail or selling products, but they will say 10 different things. If you can take those 10 different things and distill the one or two words that gets repeated over and over again, that's kind of the story after that, right? So one of the things we did really early on was we spoke to our merchants. We didn't have very many merchants in the early days, but we communicated with them and said, why do you use Shopify? What is the job you are hiring the Shopify software to do for you? And in many cases it was, well, I had this hobby and I wanted to know if people were interested in it, and Shopify made me realize that people want to buy this thing. In other cases it was, I needed to put myself through law school, I needed to sell something or make money, and Shopify was the answer for that. And it turned out that what Shopify did, the job that we provide, is that we spread entrepreneurship. That's it. We spread entrepreneurship. And for different people, that means different things. But what I would do is I would actually talk to the people that are using your product, what you're doing, and say, what is the job you're trying to accomplish? Because if you were to ask Wall Street what Shopify does, they would give you some ridiculous memorandum which had all these buzzwords in it about what we do. And that is very different than the person who an hour ago at her mom's kitchen table signed up for Shopify and started selling jewelry. So I think asking them what the job that they're doing is, that your software is doing or your product is doing, I think is a great way to figure out what your story is. And then from that, tell that story over and over and over again until enough people stop listening to you, and hopefully they won't. Yeah.
I also think, just to pick up on that, is that every opportunity and every room you're in is an opportunity to talk about what you're doing. So when you stand up in front of a group, it's an opportunity to say exactly what you're doing, to tell people who you are, because you just don't know who's in the room with you today, who can help you. So work on that as well. And I know, Harley, you've always been great at that. Every time from the moment I met you, I always knew what you were selling from that day. So I think that
Not sure that's a compliment, but yes.
No,
Yeah,
it is.
yeah.
It is a compliment. It is, absolutely. Let's do one more question, and I think then we're probably out of time.
Yeah, I will say this just once, just while we're kind of walking over with the microphone. This community, I think you guys know this, but this community is everything for me. The Ottawa entrepreneurship community, like, this is my tribe. And I don't get out as much as I'd like to this tribe, but it's incredibly important to me. And so I want to make this offer, and I was going to do it by email or on Twitter, but I'm going to do it now in person. I want to be helpful as much as I can. I've started doing a little bit of angel investing, but that's not really scalable. I can't invest in everyone's company. I can't meet all of you one-on-one. But if there is something that I can do to be helpful to you, or you see some event that going on at Shopify, like Fresh Founders, and you feel that can be helpful to you, please let me know. I wish I was able to spend more time with this community, but Shopify would be nothing, and I don't think I would. I think I'd be a big ball of untapped potential if it wasn't for this Ottawa entrepreneurship community. So I want to make that offer to this community, and I mean that genuinely. So.
Thank you so much, Harley. What are your thoughts on Bitcoin?
I think Bitcoin provides a ton of value, particularly now that we have more and more merchants that are selling all over the world, where currencies are getting really complicated and fluctuations in Forex is getting complicated. I think the fact that there's one currency or one alternative currency that levels the playing field globally, I think is really important. I think as you get into more industries that are, how should I put this, that are less mainstream industries, for example, the marijuana industry, which is becoming really hot here in Canada, Bitcoin becomes even more important. So I think we're in the early days of it. But international and less commercial product industries or product verticals, that's where you're going to find your greatest value long term. But this is really early days. And for those of you that are focused on alternative payment methods, whether it's Bitcoin or it's anything else, I think there's a lot of opportunity in the future, and we hope to be a catalyst for that. So, go you.
Thank
you. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. And Harley, I should just ask, because you did put out that offer, what's the best way for people to reach you? Is it Twitter? Find you on social media?
Yeah, find me on Twitter at HarleyF is probably the easiest way. But yeah, make sure it gets my attention, because I want to be helpful, but you got to put a little work in for that, I think. And thank you for coming. Amber just came in an hour ago from another speaking gig in another city just to do this, and so thank you so much for doing this to me here.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.